Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Damario Patterson, and I have the pleasure of hosting this event, and I'm guiding you through this entire session. And so I'm really happy about that. I'm happy to see all of you joining from all areas of the world to participate in this very interesting, very relevant and important discussion, especially in the time in which we now exist. Before I introduce the presenter, I will just get into a few administrative protocols just to ensure that we have a smooth session. And so all microphones have been muted by the host and will remain muted until the Q&A session that will come after the presenter has finished making her presentation. And this is very important to ensure that the presenter is not unduly disturbed and can freely present. Then at the Q&A session, the microphones will, or you will be allowed to unmute your microphones. But of course, if you have any question, please be sure to either send the question in the chat and I will be sure to proffer them on your behalf. Or if you'd like to ask your own question via the microphone, please raise your hand and then I will indicate and call upon you, and then you unmute your mic and speak. It's very important that we adhere to these protocols to ensure a smooth session. Additionally, this meeting is recorded, and therefore, please note that your voice and your video, should you turn your video on, will be recorded and will be saved and distributed. And so thank you all for being here. We have a very great presenter today in the person of Miss Andrea Gaymes Mohess, who is a proud UA alumna, and she holds a Master of Science degree in Counselling Psychology from the University of the West Indies, Cayville campus. She has been practicing in the field of psychology for the past 10 years. Currently, Mrs. Gaymes Mohess is reading for her PsyD in psychology, specializing in behavioral health leadership from Walden University. Currently, she's based in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, primarily attached to St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College, and she supports local projects and organizations. Mrs. Gaymes Mohess is actively involved in the Caribbean, consulting on psychosocial projects and supporting organizations in the region. She's an advocate for mental health, gender equality, and youth development, and she loves nature and performing art. Without further delay, I now present Mrs. Andrea Gaymes Mohess.
Thank you, Damario, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and we really appreciate you being with us. Are you hearing me clearly? Just want to make sure that I do that check-in before I start.
You can.
Yes, all right. So this evening, we're going to be looking at the growth mindset, and I'm going to present it in different dimensions. I am not an economist, I am a psychologist. So I'm going to be looking at the psychological and the social aspects, but psychology, economics, all social sciences are related. And the material that is presented can be related to any aspect of your life. It's just how you use the information and how you apply it. So I'm gonna get right in this evening because I only have an hour and I want to utilize the time provided. Right? So before we even get into defining the growth mindset, I want to break down the areas of growth and mindset, right? So growth is a process. It entails the methodology, strategy, inner and outer elements that influence movement. So in many areas, you may think of growth only from a plan perspective, or you may think of it as a developmental perspective in terms of you move from a child to an adolescent, to an adult. But when we look at it in terms of what it stands for, it's really about moving and movement and transitions. And in this process, when we relate it to our own daily lives, it incorporates values, system, characteristics, investment, energy, renewal, restructuring, regenerating. And it also creates and also incorporates impulses as well in terms of how we grow and how we move. And when we think of growth, we also look at increase in terms of size. If we look at ourselves, as we get older, we could either grow in size or get small in some situations. We can look at height, we can look at weight, right? But when we think of increase, it also talks about equity. How much are we investing in that, and what are the results and impact? Increase also looks at success, failures, yielding or stagnation, and it also looks at the value, the worth, and the development. And most importantly, when we measure increase, we look at the results, right? So anybody across the board, whether you're a professional or a student, when you think of that word or you think of growth, you also think of results as well. What am I seeing? What is the outcome? And another element I want to base on my research is looking at maturity, right? And maturity incorporates, the strength, the depth or understanding. It looks at adaptability. Are we grown or versus are we growing, right? Are we alive versus are we no more in existence? And also it looks at, if we look at it from a professional standpoint, it looks at standards, ethics, boundaries, and most importantly, maturity, it also looks at safety, right? The physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological safety. But another area we want to look at in terms of when we think of maturity is what are the lessons are we pulling from this process of growth, right? What did we learn? Are we flexible? Did we stay in one space? Is there a shape to how we are maturing, right? So just breaking down that element for those who have just joined in terms of growth. And when we think of the natural process of growth, if we look at it from an agricultural perspective, plants start off as a seed, right? And the seed has its own internal mechanisms to help it grow, but it cannot grow alone. So it needs someone, or yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but some persons are complaining that they are not able to hear you well, and so they're asking if you're able to project a bit.
All right. Let me
Or
just,
the earphones were.
let me switch. Are you hearing me better now in terms of projection?
Well, I've always been able to hear you.
Right.
Other
Let me,
persons.
let me probably switch to my headset and see if that might help a bit. Let's see if this helps. Okay.
All right. So just please type in the chat really quickly if you are able to hear her better now, those persons who were complaining before.
Right.
All right, all right. I'm not seeing anybody, but I see persons saying that they are hearing clearly, so I'm going to
Okay.
Okay, yes, they have said it's much. Right.
Okay, good. So when we think of understanding the natural growth process, and I'm going to put it from an agricultural perspective, in that a seed has its own internal mechanisms to grow, but it cannot grow alone. So it needs a farmer or someone, or whether it's an animal or an organism, to plant it into a particular soil. But based on how it's planted, based on the soil, based on the nutrients, based on the elements, that determines also how the internal mechanism of that seed, that seedling, how it grows into different stages. But when we think of the growth process, some of it also incorporates an element of hard work. But as I said before, the seed also has its own internal instincts that push it forward. And what I want us to pull, especially because many of us are going through a pandemic or incidents in the Grenadines, we've had so many challenges and changes, is where we want to look at developing that internal mechanism to push us forward, but also looking at what we need to develop outside of ourselves as well in order to create a growth mindset. So when we think of mindset, we think of a thought process, we look at attitudes, we look at behaviors. And when we break down thought process, it's where we're looking at the balance between positive and negative thoughts, our cognitive processing skills, or the way our brain works, our perceptions, our beliefs, right? and also our intelligence. And intelligence and cognitive processing are two different elements, where with intelligence is based on achievement and what we take in from our environment, and the cognitive processing skills is that internal working of our brain. And each of us have different mechanisms or different strength factors in the way our brain works. Then we talk about attitudes. What are our coping skills? How do we respond to things? What are the feelings that we gravitate to first, or those emotions that are internal, that we internalize and that we demonstrate? We look at characteristics and also our value systems. And when we think of behaviors, we look at actions and intentions. How do we respond to change? How do we respond to stagnation? How do we respond to people around us and our relationships, also our community, and what impact do we make, right? So the growth mindset was developed by Carol Dweck and her colleagues at Stanford University. And what they came up with is the growth mindset, the belief that an individual's capabilities and talents can be improved over time. So in their research, they looked at that progression of life, your lifespan, in terms of how are you daily embracing and enhancing and creating through your talents, through your capabilities, and how are you pivoting within your environment. It looks at progress. And one of the elements in looking at the research of the growth mindset is where it focuses also on the openness to support, where I understand that there's so many different mechanisms that can push me forward, but also how am I contributing to my community and to my whole in order to push that area forward. It also looks at the individual makes an effort, even if it takes time to move forward. So even when I do work with students, I would say to them, if you compare yourself based on different contexts, you might either rush ahead or you might take too long in making decisions in terms of how you move. But a person with a growth mindset doesn't focus on time. They focus on how can I achieve one goal step by step. It's not based solely or measured by intelligence. And the elements of intelligence where we measure performance through a grade or where we measure performance through merit is that when you label intelligence, it takes away that natural growth process for an individual. So when you attach a grade, it more focuses on the praise element than that growth element of learning. And then I have added an element that we use in psychological first aid, which is, listens, looks, and links. So somebody with a growth mindset, they listen to not only what is happening around them, but they're also listening to their internal voice. They're observing and they're looking to see where the gaps and the avenues and the opportunities that I can grasp. And they're creating links where they're understanding that growth is not based solely on myself as the individual, but it's also based on those connections and those linkages that I make within my community and also who I surround myself with. And in the growth mindset is where the individual is creative, reflective, and consistent. One of the key ingredients of the growth mindset is consistency, where each day, each moment, I'm working towards the specific goal I set out to achieve. Right? So we're going to look at the growth mindset versus a fixed mindset and what is the difference. So the fixed mindset, there's a fear of failure, right? So there is a perfectionistic perspective where I don't want to, if I fail, all is lost. Also, a person with a fixed mindset avoids new challenges and new experiences, and they appear very rigid or closed to different opportunities, or they may question opportunities. So if they're going into a situation where there's change or where there's transition, there's that hesitancy to move forward. So in some situations, someone in a fixed mindset can look very indecisive as well. Or if there is sudden movement or sudden transitions, they may lash out in terms of how their behaviors may present. In some situations, there's a lot of insecurity or they're overly concerned about competence. So person may ruminate on a particular activity, or they may not take that jump or that risk to move, or invest the time and work to move. So what happens is there isn't any sort of growth or any sort of transition into a next stage. It's where sometimes hard work is perceived or preserved, it's supposed to be perceived as a chore. So there's that want to move, but the effort and the tenacity that it takes to move, it's perceived as very difficult. And also independence is perceived as a solo act or mission. And when we think of independence or the idea of independence, although it's perceived as you're working by yourself, it also creates an illusion that I alone can achieve this. And what we've recognized, we look at the realities of growth, is that there's so many different elements to help us achieve things. So if we think of the seedling, it needs water, it needs oxygen, it needs air, right? It needs sunlight. So if the seed thinks that it's the only one who's moving, then it creates that illusion that I only have what's inside of me to move forward. So I just presented some narratives or some statements that you might hear from a person with a fixed mindset versus a person with a growth mindset, right? So some statements you may hear that is just either I'm good at it or I'm not, right? While someone who has a growth mindset, their narrative will be, I can learn to do anything I want to. Now, that is notwithstanding that you may need to expose yourself to material or to information to help you learn, right? But the idea is that if I sit and I create that process, I can accomplish it. Another narrative is if I don't try, then I won't fail, right? That's from the fixed mindset. Sorry. And the growth mindset would say, I only fail when I stop trying, right? So, even in some cases, with someone with a growth mindset, the word try is sometimes not in their narrative. It's about doing, right? What am I doing to make this happen? So I've divided the growth mindset into 3 categories. So we're going to look at self, relationship, and community. Oops. All right. So the wording is a little small here, but we hear a lot of Robert Nesta Marley's statement of emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And I've added to it, it starts with one mind, right? So when we think of the concept of emancipation and when we think of the experience of slavery, right? What I want to pull away from in terms of applying that quote to the growth mindset, it's where we're able to look into our past for the lessons that were learned, but we're not stepping into it, right? We're looking to let go of the hurts and the pain and the triggers. So when we look at our past, we're not triggered by it. We're able to pull the experiences to see what we need to embrace the present and what we need to move forward in the future. And it's much bigger than just looking at history. It's also looking at what's happening in the here and now. It's looking at what is around me to help me move forward. So when we think of the growth mindset and the concept of self, is where we look at self-acceptance and self-awareness. Am I willing to own what I'm feeling in the moment? Am I willing to look at my strengths, my flaws, my weaknesses? Am I willing to look at all elements of self? And many times we hide things or we hide our flaws in order to create that, what we sometimes call a false sense of security, because we don't want to challenge it or we don't want to address it, or even things from our past, we're not able to learn from it. And that hinders growth or the growth mindset when we look at ourselves. Also, when we think of self, if we look at mental flexibility, are we able to create those psychological and emotional movements and angles to embrace change? So when we think of emotions and in psychology, even as a clinician, we try not to separate positive and negative emotions. We label them and we call them for simplicity, but each emotion has a role to play. But the key in working with them is looking at how can I spin that wheel? So if I'm afraid, how can I change the concept or the perception to move into courage? How can I create the narrative and the language that I need to move into that stage of hope? So it's where you're moving and you're creating a dance with yourself, where you're understanding what you're thinking in the moment. And as we go along the presentation, we'll also see what are some areas or some concerns that can create these blockages in terms of creating that self-awareness and an ability to really pivot and move and be flexible mentally. When we think of the growth mindset and in terms of self, it's where you're always a student, you're always learning, and you're creating processes. So you're not plunging into activities without a plan or without some sort of structure. And even if the structure does not hold up or is not applicable, we're able to create new structures and new processes. It's where we're pulling from our environment and seeing what are the lessons that I can use to make this work. And it's also about taking a risk. But I like to add the element of taking calculated risk, where we're able to see opportunities to move with it, understanding the threats and understanding the risk. So you're not just plunging into something just to take the risk and say, okay, well, I'm just doing it. But you're calculating that moment, you're seeking information, you're able to move forward in terms of what is the opportunity in this problem. So even if we apply to our, the pandemic and what we're experiencing now, or even the other challenges you're experiencing in your own life, is when there's some persons who would have been able to take that opportunity and some persons who are not able to do that based on how they would have calculated that risk. So in terms of being ready to emancipate your mind or being able to cultivate an internal growth mindset, these are some tips and some strategies I've developed that you can apply and even doing your own research that you can expand on. So the first one is, am I able to embrace my strengths and imperfections? Am I able to admit where I'm struggling and also look at how my strengths can help me balance out those imperfections? Am I able to reflect and view challenges as an opportunity? So do I pull back, or can I say, okay, can I take a look and see where are the gaps that I can jump in to create a new opportunity or create a solution to this issue? Can I weigh the benefits, the disadvantages, and the rewards? And you may think of benefits as just a reward, or they may sound similar. But the thing with the reward is where there's that big movement or that ability to really zone into, okay, this is what I've achieved, where a benefit may be just a small, minute thing, and then the disadvantages in terms of, can I weigh the failures? And if I make this decision, what are the pros and what are the cons of that? Can I replace the word failing with learning, right? Where we take away that element of shame. And I like to add in terms of shameless persistence, right? Am I able to pull from every element of failure, sit with it, really ruminate, not ruminate to the point that you're just there and they're not making a decision, but you're able to pull it apart and say, okay, I learned this, then I'm going to add this, then I'm going to move this along. Can I set the internal and external boundaries? And what I mean by that is, especially when you think of your thought process, where you're able to say, okay, no, if I think this way, then it's gonna block me. So can I remind myself not to go down that path? And then the external boundaries would be, what are the standards I'm setting for myself? What are the ethics that I'm setting for myself either as a professional or even as a student? What are some elements that I need to remove within my life or within my structures to help me to grow as an individual? The other one is, can I create a growth behavioral action plan where my behaviors are intentional, where I'm adding elements as being persistent, being determined, creating a network, seeking information, doing research? Can I create an action plan for that so that I'm able to map and see where I'm going? And the next one is trusting the process. And trust is something that's very complex, but also in a way has elements of simplicity with it, where I'm able to take time to trust myself, to trust the elements around me, or invest small, minute percentages of trust into different elements within my life. So the trust I may have for a family member, I may not have the same for a coworker, but then that coworker may be able to propel me along in my growth So I need to probably invest some more of that, but I'm also trusting the entire process where that helps you to learn day by day or minute by minute what is happening around you. The next one is to own your emotions, but choose emotions that will create progress and a balanced perspective. And sometimes we may say, okay, well, sometimes I can't choose my emotions. But once you work through in terms of being clear with yourself, if you take a moment and you're like, okay, these are the areas that I struggle with. So I tend to get anxious very quickly. You ask yourself, is anxiety helpful in this moment or is it harmful? If it's harmful, if it's going to keep me stuck, then how do I create that mechanism to turn it into something that's different? And the thing is that fear is also used, or stress is sometimes used as a push factor to drive us into something that we're holding back ourselves from. So if we step into it too deeply, then we can hold ourselves back. But if we pull from fear and create it into bravery or courage, then we're able to create that mechanism to say, okay, when I'm choosing this emotion, I'm choosing confidence to step into a space that I think I'm uncomfortable with. But as I pick up the rhythm, as I learn about it more, I'm able to be confident in this space. And the next one is, am I open to a community? Meaning, am I able to network? Can I reach out to persons to help me to move along if I recognize that I'm stuck in a particular area? So, as I like to say, support is all around you. And it doesn't have to be an individual, it can be a program, it could be a course, it could be a book. That it helps you to now see that I'm not alone in this situation, and I can pull from other areas in my community to help me grow. The other one is to understand the dance of change and transition. Now, many times persons may say that, I don't like change. Now, there are different persons who have different perspective. My perspective on this is sometimes it's not that we don't like change, but we may not like the commitment and the different factors that change bring with it. So if you're looking at your life in terms of understanding the dance, where there are certain elements of inevitability in change. If you think of a dance, sometimes the rhythm has to slow down, sometimes it has to speed up based on the message that you want to portray to your audience. So if you think of yourself, what is the internal message that I want to give myself? And what is the external message I want to give those around me in terms of understanding this dance of change? The other one, in terms of looking at your mind, in terms of yourself, is to have a calm routine and a balance between learning, which is your academics, and experience. So in some situations, you have to study, you have to do research, but your experience also gives you an element of education that you also have to reflect on. What are the lessons am I learning from this experience? How did it make me feel? What are the thoughts it brought to mind when I think about it? And can I develop a calm routine to help me be open to that process without closing up or being stuck? So if we look at the other dimension of relationships in the growth mindset, and relationships are very important as well for us as human beings. Because we're going through the pandemic, that touch or that intimacy is limited. But what we're going to go through tonight is, how can I still create these forms and create these elements in order for me to grow in my relationships? So the first one is connection, healthy feedback, and support. And connection is talking about that alliance. Now, everybody may not be a good fit, but can I invest enough in terms of, can I learn what this person needs and learn what this person brings to me in order to form that connection? And sometimes we create attachments or unhealthy attachments that keep us enmeshed. And if we lose that person, we're not able to stand, or if they disappoint us, we feel devastated. So in building that connection in terms of looking at it in a healthy way is where we're able to learn about that individual without plunging into the relationship or wanting to form that bond before we get to understand all elements of that. And then can we examine what are some of the things I can accept and what are some of the things I can't accept about this, in order to know how to make that connection or that alliance with the individual. The other one is healthy feedback. Can we be honest with each other? Can we provide positive feedback? And if we do provide negative feedback, is it feedback that the person can learn from? And the delivering the feedback, is it opening up that opportunity for growth on you in terms of the relationship. So sometimes we say we're giving constructive feedback. Now, the thing with constructive feedback, sometimes the delivery hinders the person's ability to grow. So if we're thinking about relationships, can we develop some empathy in the way we provide feedback, in making it in a way that help both of us grow and thrive in the relationship, rather than creating a mechanism that could create blockages? And the next one is support systems. Do we keep each other in ways, or do we bound with each other that we can stifle each other? Can we provide some sort of balance within the relationship that we're able to learn together, that we're able to expand together? And it's not only about material gain, excuse me, but it's also about us supporting and creating that mechanism for movement with a system rather than an a healthy attachment. So we want to talk about a relationship growth mindset in terms of creating allies, building network based on trust, truth, and honesty. And why I separate truth and honesty is that sometimes we can say we're honest with persons, but we are not standing in our truth, and we're more or less pivoting to accommodate rather than creating an ally built on what we are aware of, in terms of our acceptance of ourselves, in terms of our truth, in terms of what we believe in our value system, but also invest in the right amount of trust to create that ally. So if you think about creating allies, it's where, can I create a network that if I fall short, this person is able to pick me up, no matter what the relationship is, in terms of whether it's family, whether it's a colleague. Am I able to really build that ally, but also understanding how much trust to invest? So sometimes where we fall short is we might invest too much trust, and then the person disappoints us. And then what we do, we break that relationship. But if we recognize, okay, from this person is not capable of supporting me or creating this type of ally, but there are other elements of them where they are strong at that they can help me, then I invest the right amount, but I still keep that relationship. And in some cases, you may have to disregard the relationship. And that's where we go into boundaries. So exploring weaknesses, strengths, and the ability to know each other's limits, and if this is also meaningful to me. So if we go back to the natural growth process, um, plants shed their leaves if they realize that this is not meaningful to my growth. So they have to disconnect and they have to get rid of it at some point in order to grow and to open up that opportunity for new alliances and new relationships that can add meaning, right? The next one is, in your relationships is where you cultivate gratitude and empathy, where you celebrate moments of progress, understanding difficulties, and helping, supporting, and reaching out. And what that means is that, am I capable in my relationship to appreciate what the person is bringing to me? And I am appreciating what I am bringing to them, or are they appreciating what I am offering to them? But also, am I understanding what our strengths are and our difficulties are? And can we work through them? Do we need external support for this relationship to move forward? And can we create a supporting relationship or a supporting mechanism where no matter what, we're committed to moving forward? And if this relationship needs to shift, can we shift it in a healthy way without creating mechanisms where either of us are stuck, or creating mechanisms that can make us even stuck in our communities, or make the experiences or the experience very difficult for each other? So we're moving into now the community element, right? And we're talking about, so the quote that I've put here is, together we aspire, together we achieve. Side by side, we'll overcome. And when we talk about community, it's linked to relationships, but relationships can be more one-on-one and personal, but we're looking at a bigger picture here. And in focusing in this is where we're looking at organizations. So we're looking at things like school. We can look at elements in terms of each in Caribbean, each of our communities. We could look at how is our mindset, or what is the culture that we're portraying in our community. And when we think about the growth mindset on a community scale, is where we're examining all sectors, their strengths, their gaps, their weaknesses, And I like to pull into the element of the UN sustainability goals. So UN has many different goals in terms of these are some of the sectors and the areas that we focus on when we're making policies. And when you think about your community, is every area represented? Are we looking at all gaps when we're creating businesses, when we're educating our students, when we are, looking at our sectors in terms of growth, when we're thinking about this pandemic, are we looking at how each sector is affected by our decision? And if you think of it as an individual basis, where many of us are different professionals in different fields, and if you're not and you're a student, how am I impacting what's happening around me, right? Are my decisions inclusive? Am I looking at diversity? And when we think about the community mindset, and we go back to, that quote from Bamali in terms of emancipating our mind, are we only putting on one lens and zoning into one group or one subgroup? Are we looking at all elements? So we have a school. Are we just focusing on the teachers and their development? Are we looking at our janitors? Are we looking at our support team? Are we looking at our administrative team? If we're thinking about our families, and that is a community, is everybody in my group or in my sector, in my family, are they supported? Am I paying attention to what they need? Am I paying attention to what I need and how I impact their needs as well? And then are we looking at strategy versus analysis? So sometimes in a fixed mindset, they're more critical of what are the problems, but we're not celebrating the strengths and looking at how can we then take this strong element and sort out this problem, or maybe just get rid of this altogether and pulling a new opportunity. Are we creating a strategy in terms of how we're moving forward in our communities? And the next one is, are we creating networks? Are we able to take that calculated risk to branch out, to move into a new group and to a new sector? Are we able to pull other elements together, even if we have differences, and see how we can work side by side? And the other one is, are we creating healthy competition? So one of the hindrances of growth or progress is comparison, because sometimes we're looking out more than we're looking in and out. So we're not inspired by what's outside and see what do we have to create growth for ourselves in terms of what are our strengths. We try to mimic what's happening around us, or we're more focused on beating the competition rather than looking at all of us are in this group together and how can we work forward together, competing amongst ourselves to push ourselves or to motivate ourselves, but not creating stagnation in terms of those jealousy or those pull and tugs that can also hinder growth. Are we providing avenues for growth? So even for persons who have businesses, and you may have employees who may seem demotivated or uninterested, are there avenues for growth in my company? Are there avenues for growth in my school? Are there avenues for growth in my community? Am I doing projects and programs that are really pushing, encouraging, building our human capital and focusing on human development? Or are we only focusing on infrastructure development, but not creating those mechanisms to really open up the mind, to encourage creativity, to encourage reflection? And when I talk going into the next point in terms of reflective thinking, in terms of, are we looking at all elements and also projecting beyond what we're seeing? So if we, so a part of my experiences before the COVID or the pandemic, we would have been exposed to telehealth for since about 2013 or even before in 2010. But a lot of clinicians were against it because it says it takes away that real element. But now we are forced to use it. Now the preparation or the taking the risk to understand telehealth for me back in 2010 or 2013 helps me to function in 2021, right? But it's also looking at, am I able to think beyond the here and now? Can I look at those gaps and see, okay, how is society progressing? How is modernization affecting our community? How are these things affecting our community? And do we have the mechanisms in place? And are we willing to invest in that to create growth in our community? The next one is openness to feedback. And this is a very, very, very important one, Because as Caribbean people, sometimes we're ready to defend rather than listen to what is being said to us. Because anything that's negative creates an element of shame. So, in order to reduce that, where we're able to listen to those difficult conversations and think about what is it that we need to move forward, or if this person is providing a negative feedback, what can we provide to help them move forward or to help our own organization and community move forward? And the next point is balancing the prize and the progress process. Sometimes we focus on just the reward and not the process. So are we thinking about, are we overwhelmed during the process? Is the process stretching us out too thin? Are there too many gaps in the process? So even though we were successful, how we got success, is it feasible to stand up to any sort of changes or transitions? Or is it just impulsive? Or is it just reactive? So what I encourage persons to, especially when look at it on a community scale, is to create a growth framework and policies where creating a growth mindset culture within your organizations and within your communities, where you're encouraging professional development in your organizations, but not only professional development because of professional development's sake, but it's continuous, where we have mentors, we have supervisors who understand that when we're interacting with employees, we need to be able to create that balanced approach where we're able to create that thinking of to have that element of creativity in our thinking, to always creating a strategy to move forward and then asking ourselves in the next 10 years, where do we want to be? In the next 5 years, where do we want to be? And if we look at it for ourselves, where even as an individual, can I create a framework for myself in terms of an action plan to grow and to move forward, taking all elements around me, looking at challenges not with disdain, but with excitement, being able as a company to know that we have the capability to pivot and to move forward, right? So when we think of a growth culture, it's where you're creating a policy and a framework that has an element of growth in it, where your organizational plans or your missions or your statements or your visions propel growth. Sometimes what happens is that you may have a mission statement there, but nobody's reflecting on it and nobody's assessing, is it really taking this company into the next stage, or is it just keeping us within a particular mindset and a particular culture? It's where you look at the collective team where all sectors are represented. So if you have a management team, is everybody represented? Each department? Does anybody feel left out? Because what happens is you may focus on one group, but that group only takes your organization or take your culture into one direction. And what happens, we're not able to expand and move, and then things kind of fall apart. Are we demonstrating appreciation for feedback, whether it's difficult, constructive, positive, or negative? Are we encouraging our employees to look at the whole picture or avoid one size fits all? Or sometimes, as we say, we're fitting a square into a round hole, where eventually when the square comes out, all the edges are jagged and it no longer looks like a square. So even when we think of a community, are we encouraging a community that looks at that whole picture, that sees what the outcome can be, or what the risk assessment, when we do a risk assessment, what the outcome can be? When we do that projection, what can happen in the next few times if I take this angle, and can look at the challenges in a mindset that helps them to move forward? Are we encouraging a language of growth where we're looking at what, how, when, where we're not just asking why? So when we think of a language of growth, is where we look at creating solutions and embracing problems in a way as our challenges as an area for us to not only move, but also expand and to grow. And we're able to be progressive in our mindset, where we encouraging a language of that fosters emotional maturity, where we're able to look at fears and examine fears and to own them, but also know that we can move them into a different dimension. We're encouraging a culture of mindfulness, where we exist and embrace the present. We're developing a sense of calm, where we're not driven by a sense of anxiety. And if we do feel anxiety, We understand that if we're not able to manage it, that if we're not able to keep that balance, that we can create reactions and future challenges that can keep us stuck. Are we able to look at what's happening within us in order to guide us into guide us into the future? Are we creating intentional behaviors for growth? So where we're deciding, okay, we're going to do this in order to move our community forward, where we're going to look at it as a whole, where we have key stakeholders and gatekeepers making sure that these behaviors are fostered and developed, right? So when we look at skills and values to cultivate a growth mindset, there are some, I've chosen 6, but there are other value sets and other characteristics that you can add to this as well. So accountability. Are we able to admit when we are wrong, embrace when we are right, and create that balance and create solutions to move forward? Are we committed to the process of growth? And to grow takes commitment, but also it also looks at, am I also committed when I fail to move forward into success? Do I need to be transplanted in a different way to grow? Do I need to prune some things around me in order to grow? And am I committed to that process, right? Do I have trust? Not only trust in others, but also trust in myself, trust in the process, knowing how much trust to invest into my networks, not being naive, but also not being closed off, and being willing to be vulnerable when necessary. Also, trust also incorporates boundaries. Am I able to tell the truth when necessary? Am I able to stand up for what I believe in when necessary? And adaptability is a key element of growth as well. Where am I able to spread my roots and to move and to pivot and to really create those transitions to move from stage 1 to stage 2? May not be 100% smooth, but I'm able to look at those jagged areas when I'm not smooth or I'm not pivoting properly to see what is it that I need to improve? What is it that I need to decrease? What is it that I need to enhance in order to move to that next stage? And another key value and another skill set is resilience. We've heard a lot about resilience during the pandemic, but resilience and adaptability work hand in hand. The thing is that one of the definitions of resilience is bouncing back into form, but the true growth mindset of resilience is bouncing forward, right? Because you may not be able to go back to what you would have left behind, and you may not be able to move back to the form that you would have moved from. So it's really taking that element of moving forward or bouncing forward from one stage into the next and able to pivot and create that rhythm for movement. And the next one is flexibility. How much can I stretch and adjust my way into different things? And it's similar to adaptability, but it's where you're more pliable, you're more bendable, where you're able to take whatever feedback comes your way and make it into a learning lesson for yourself, for your relationships, and for your community. So I'm going to just briefly go into what are some areas that hinder the growth mindset, what causes someone to stay in a fixed mindset. And complex trauma, any trauma experience can do that. So if we look at it from a neurological perspective, when trauma happens to an individual, it alters the brain's ability to sometimes shift easily. It hinders the person's ability to really execute or utilize what we call executive functioning or utilize those prefrontal cortex areas, because you're responding to something in your past that you have not dealt with, or even in your present that you have not dealt with, and it's creating a trigger response rather than a proactive response. And in these situations, persons may need more support and help in order to overcome this, in order to achieve a growth mindset. So if we were to do a visual demonstration of what your headspace looks like, it has so many things inside that it cannot provide you with clarity, because you may not even know what you're responding to or what you're reacting to. And when we think about this pandemic with all the different elements of how different governments or countries would have dealt with it, we have persons who have been severely affected, and it has affected their mental health. It has affected their ability to move forward. and there is a need for intervention when this happens. The other one is that an individual may focus on validation and praise, where actions are only done for that external validation or that appraisal. And there is no real introspection in terms of looking at how am I growing, or I'm just doing activities to get that validation. The next is a lack of enhancement of creative, reflective, and mental flexibility. So even in some of our systems, whether it be education system or even homes, if you're not fostering that creativity and reflective and mental flexibility with your children in order to helping them to self-regulate, in order to helping them to learn behaviors to be persistent and grow, then that hinders their ability to learn those skills. The truth is the growth mindset, empathy, all those things, skills are learned behaviors as well. So we have those inner instincts, but many of them are learned. So if they're not being enhanced in the environment, then the individual are not learning those skill sets to move forward. The other one is with the perfectionistic mentality. So where I have to have everything a particular way, or I need to have this element of control to have things exactly the way I put it. What that does is that it blocks the ability of life happening, of things changing, of disappointment happening. And then a person can fall apart and not be able or feel stuck or helpless in this situation. Another one is inconsistent feedback. So where one time somebody may say, okay, this is good work, and then the next time they may say this is not good work. So then the person is not sure where they need to grow. And then they may be doing their own internal introspection. And then when they put all the feedback together, there isn't consistent areas or things that they can use to help them grow. So what happens, it can make a person feel overwhelmed and make them stuck. So for self-preservation, they will focus on what they want to grow on, and not listen to all the other feedback because it's so inconsistent. Another element is lack of exposure. And especially in the Caribbean, sometimes where we may not be exposed as much as we should be in terms of what are some of the opportunities out there, or we may not have a workforce that is learned enough to understand how to really grasp and work with opportunities, that can also hinder growth. And it's also a culture of rigidity where there may be cultures or subcultures that just focus on one particular value system and one particular framework. They're not willing to shift. And that also hinders the growth mindset from developing. So what happens from culture to culture, from individual to individual, that culture of rigidity or that mindset of rigidity stays. In some cases, mental illness as well. So things like clinical depression, anxiety disorders, those hinder a person's ability to actually move and grow in certain circumstances. And as I said before, difficulties in self-regulation or executive function skills, that ability to understand how your behavior impacts another person, the ability to really regulate your emotions, also the ability to move when change happens, how you move with it or how flexible you are in terms of your cognitive processing skills. So some mixed perceptions of the growth process or the growth mindset is what we call toxic positivity, where that person who may be always positive without creating a process, where you're not looking at the situation as a whole, where you're just only focusing on that one element. That can blind you as well and make you create solutions that may not be applicable or appropriate to the situation. So if you're saying, you know what, I can speak well, I can do this, or I'm not creating the mechanisms to learn how to communicate clearly or to learn how to do different things, then what happens, you stay in a framework of toxic positivity, and that hinders your ability to grow. Um, I've put affirmations where the growth mindset is not affirmations. You can tell yourself positive things, but if there's no action, then what happens is just words. It's just a booster shot, it's just a euphoria that isn't taking you to the next stage. So there needs to be a process in terms of what are the behaviors that I need, what are the skills that I need to help me accomplish this particular goal or to carry me on the road to success. Otherwise, they'll just be words in vain. The other one, misperception of the growth mindset is idealism or certain ideals. So we have these positive ideals, or these ideals that keep us there, but then they're not linking with the reality in terms of where we're at or what's happening within that moment. So what happens, the ideal stays an ideal, and when reality kicks in or when disappointment comes, then you may fall apart and not able to know how to pivot because I'm holding on to this particular ideal and I'm not able to move with it. The other one is comparison, right? In terms of where we look at each other or trying to compare another for inspiration, that's not really a particular growth mindset. What you're doing is you can look out and admire and maybe look in yourself and say, okay, maybe I need to work on this. But if it's causing you a lot of negative emotions or causing you to hinder or it's making you feel to recluse, then what happens is that isn't a healthy way in terms of moving into growth. So persons may compare somebody to somebody to really create an inspiration, but that sometimes may not work to create growth. If we think of a garden, a flower is a flower, and each of them have their different beauty and their different elements, but they all have a particular role to play based on what they're designed to do. So it's really to help a person to see their strengths and what they have inside. And even if there's something they admire about someone, is where they have to ask themselves, is that a fit for me? And the growth mindset is not only about motivation. The real key element to the growth mindset is consistency and discipline that help to create motivation. The more you push at something or work at something, those little rewards, when you get it, creates the motivation. But without discipline, then it cannot materialize, or you're not able to see that growth or to learn from the experience of failure. So, in summary, because I'm coming close to my time, the growth mindset focuses on process, balance, and movement, right? It's about creating alliances, creating those connections, and understanding that as much as I'm going through this by myself at some point, I am not doing it by myself. That I'm a part of a network, I'm a part of an alliance, and can I create those alliances to help me grow and develop? It's also finding a middle ground in the chaos. Um, Sometimes when I talk about this point, when you think of a hurricane, there's always an eye and that sense of calm. Can I find that middle point, that calm, that eye, to help me look at each side of my chaos in terms of what are the lessons that I want to learn from this situation? How can I pull from this pandemic? What can I pull to apply to myself to help me to grow? What can I learn from this situation of disappointment to help me to grow? But first, you have to validate what you're feeling. So if you are feeling frustrated and you're not validating it, all you're doing is creating these mechanisms that just give you a boost, but there is no process in terms of where am I going next. And again, it's trusting the process, understanding that growth takes time, but it's continuous. It's across a lifespan. If you think about a tree, no matter how old it gets, it still has a quality to it. It still has an identity. It still has a purpose, but its roots get stronger with time. So it's able to withstand the elements. It's able to understand, okay, how much sunlight do I need? Do I need to stretch on this side? Do I need to shift on this side? But it's about trusting that process. The next one is self-awareness and creating human-friendly integration. So when we think about a community or we think about relationships, not everybody is the best fit, but can I understand what this person's role is in my life? In terms of maybe your role is to motivate and push me, but your role as well is to kind of hold me and be that support system. And key point I want to add as well is boundaries. Creating those inner boundaries for yourself, understanding where sometimes you may second guess yourself and can you create that mechanism to move with that. But also those external boundaries, people who may not give you the right push or the right energy to create that balance. Can I set those standards and ethics with them in order to keep myself safe, in order to keep my relationship safe, in order to keep my community safe?
It's 9 o'clock.
And also, it's where the growth mindset focuses on adapting to change looking into the past, but not stepping into it, not being triggered by it, but learning from it and embracing the present to shape a progressive future. So it is now 9 o'clock and my time is up. So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present. Also, if you have any questions, any comments, anything that wasn't clear, anything that you want explained.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Gaymes Mohess. An excellent presentation. Overall, just the content was great, very informative. The way in which you presented, I mean, you're just excellent, excellent. I'm at a loss of words right now for words, but we do have a number of questions coming in, which are really just geared towards getting your feedback as to how it is that persons can go about implementing some of the things that you would have spoken about. And so I'm going to proffer this question from Kathleen. I hope I'm not butchering anybody's names. Apologies in advance if I do. Right, so she was asking if you would care to entertain a discussion about biases and barriers which would have prevented economic growth in Jamaica for the last half century, so 50 years. I mean, your major's in psychology, but I hope that you're able to stretch over.
Okay, so psychology and economics are related, but I may not be able to go into it fully. But what I would add is, in terms of the bias, and I think you said the bias and the political systems.
Bias and barriers.
Right, bias and barriers in terms of human progress. So one of the biggest barriers, I think, in my understanding of Jamaican culture, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is one, the lack of resources being spread evenly across the board.
Certainly.
Two, poverty. And forgive me for my own bias, the education system in the Caribbean is a huge hindrance as well, because one of the things we don't help our students learn is that emotional and psychological component for growth. I didn't learn that until I was in grad school. And that was because most of our instructors were from either British trained or American trained, which focused on education being universal. So if we think of it in terms of the bias and the hindrance and the barriers in the Jamaican culture, with all those integrations and the ethnic barriers as well, the racial barriers that we have in terms of colorism and the distribution of resources, we can also look at inclusivity is not something, and if we think about it across the board in Caribbean, it's not something that's highlighted. So we tend to see each other as threats rather than alliances. And because we also create our education system in a subject format, we're not recognizing how everything is interrelated. So as much as I'm a psychologist, dabble in some other areas as well. And also engineers sometimes work along with psychologists, psychologists work along engineers, lawyers work along with agriculturalists, nutritionists have to work with psychologists or work with agriculturists. So everything is interconnected. But at the end of the day, we also need to recognize that we are still, as Robert Nesta Marley said, captivated in our own mental slavery, right? So if we don't emancipate ourselves and recognizing that as a Caribbean community, we're all connected, we all need each other, we all need to embrace diversity. We can have our differences, we can have our faith, we could have our beliefs, but what is the bigger picture? Where are we going to take, and for persons who are in Jamaica, how are we, especially whether you're millennial, second generation, older generation, how can we all work together to really creates balance bias, if that's a word, but also creates a sense of collectivism that can work towards a bigger picture rather than smaller groups' needs being met.
Awesome. That's an excellent point, and I can relate to a lot of what you have said, because especially under the point of comparison, I'm a twin, so I grew up being compared,
Right.
and so one of the things I would have had to be constantly, and I'm constantly working on, is trying to escape that mentality that, hey, I
Yeah.
need to be comparing myself to other people.
And the truth is, we create a culture of comparison to motivate growth, but it
Right,
actually
right.
hinders us. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. So I'm good. In that same vein, really, this question, how it is that how is it that one can maintain or preserve boundaries without stepping on toes or burning bridges?
Right.
And it may be a case where you have to step on some toes, but I'm going to allow you
Yeah.
to
Right. Then
answer
that's a hard one, I think, for persons who have a temperament of wanting to please sometimes, or wanting or thinking that everybody has to be within, within my group or my circle. Um, I think in terms of not stepping stone, Brene Brown talks about clarity being kindness. And for persons who've been in presentations, to me, it's something that I talk about regularly in terms of there's a method of delivery that creates clarity that also helps to create a therapeutic alliance. Um, and not a therapeutic alliance in terms of psychology, but more or less building on I respect you, I appreciate you, I understand that you're human, I have love for you, but we can't continue like this because if we continue this relationship, it will break at some point, right? But also it takes away from the goal that we want to achieve. For example, there are some colleagues, we check in with each other, we're good with each other, but we're not friends in terms of the investment is made differently. Um, and even as a therapist, like I tell my clients, I don't call out you in the street because if I do that, then it blurs the line. One, it jeopardizes your confidentiality. But two, my temperament or my training is a little more into the human connection and into more of really creating that unconditional positive regard. And with that, I'm investing energy into you and you're investing energy into me. So if I blur that line, then we then create a misguided ability in terms of what we can serve each other. Because we may be good as a colleague, but not good as friends,
you.
right? Or we may be good as friends, but not good as partners, right? So then it's really sometimes having those difficult conversations. And again, it's self-awareness and self-acceptance, but also acceptance of the relationship and where you want it to go. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome, really, really salient points being made. Really salient points. I have a question here from Mortimer Moxie again. Apologies if I butcher any names. Really, really sorry. They're asking, how is it that we could integrate Caribbean spirituality in all its aspects, in its variety, with your growth mindset series?
Right. And I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Mortimer. Actually, thank you for raising that because spirituality is something I tend to incorporate in my presentations. I didn't allude to it as much in this presentation, but it's really important in the growth mindset um, by separating religion from spirituality, right? And denomination from the goal that we want to achieve in spirituality. I think we get caught up, and this is my stance on my opinion, and it's not really disrespecting anybody's belief, but sometimes we get caught up in religion and meeting those religion aspects. And for persons who may ascribe to Christian belief, I'm just using it as an example in terms of if we even think about the story of the Samaritan, he helped the gentleman, but he left because he fulfilled his role and his part. And that element of spirituality in terms of connectivity and appropriateness and really being able to move. Because if we look at the whole element of spirituality, it's really about movement, it's about growth. It's about having that inner connection with self, but also that connection with community. Love thy neighbor as thyself. So if
Right.
you don't love yourself, if you don't really focus on your weaknesses, your strengths, and where you're going, then you can't serve your community or serve your relationships appropriately. So if we take spirituality in terms of growth, in terms of energies, in terms of what we're willing to give, if we even look at the different leaders in our Caribbean islands, there are different methodologies that create different results and growth within the community based on also that energy that they gave off, if you look at it from a spiritual standpoint, but also your ability to connect with what's happening around you and to grow it. That is an element that you can incorporate in your growth mindset theory. And if you do your research too, even though I would have divided into 3 tiers, growth mindset is across the board. When you do your own research, there's elements of spirituality, there's elements of education system, there's a growth mindset in the education system as well. I hope that answered your question. Sorry, Mattia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Another question, very, very interesting, because I actually discovered the terminology yesterday, really coincidentally, toxic positivity. Could you expand a bit more on toxic positivity? And this is coming from Diana McFarlane.
Right. Okay, so toxic positivity is that person is like, okay, we're gonna get this done, but they're not contributing to the process. And you're also deciding where you put your lens to. So there's a problem. So let's look at it on an organizational scale. We don't have enough resources, but we're saying, okay, we're going to push through and we're not catering for the resources. So you're investing the energy for hope or the emotion of hope, but there's no change because we're not attacking the problem. And if we take it from also a personal or a relational perspective, because I also have worked with domestic violence clients, when you think about persons stepping away from that relationship, it's not necessarily love that keeps them there. It's the hope of change. Because you're trapped into the vortex of this is gonna get better, but nothing is being done and nothing's changing. So you're paying attention to energy and not necessarily patterns of behavior. So you're paying attention to the emotional aspect of it. And where persons tend to say, oh, the person is thinking with their emotions, everything comes from the brain. So you focus on what you want to believe in, but you miss that whole key point of the process, the resources, the infrastructure, the ideals. The pandemic is a huge example of that, where everybody thought we're going into 2021. But we didn't take into consideration this is a respiratory disease, viruses mutate, things change, people's behavior, people will be resistant to change. We didn't factor in all of that. So it creates a blind spot that traps us. And it's really to pay attention to that, because you may be thinking you're growing, but you're actually just spinning top in mud, as they say in colloquial terms.
Yeah, right. So no to toxic positivity, definitely no toxic positivity around here. Our question coming from Mrs. Baptiste, with the idea in mind of alliances and connectivity as relates to the school as an important organization, do you think that it is very necessary, especially at this point in time, to begin sensitizing parents across the Caribbean about the importance of growth mindset?
Definitely. Definitely. The growth mindset starts from in vitro, from in the womb. Because a lot of what I think women and both genders are now realizing is that babies taking everything from outside inside as well. But in terms of how you distribute affection to a child, that is also in terms of research, in terms of cultivating growth, in terms of self-regulation. Sometimes we tend to say, well, let me just leave the child to cry and they'll figure it out. All those things actually affect thinking, and because the child may not have the language as yet to say what they need, but they're responding to you, they're mimicking to you. Even the element of children responding to technology. I think I was listening to a TED talk the other day, and I even noticed it in my own practice. It's not necessarily that the child has developed the cognitive ability to use technology, what they're doing is mimicking your behaviors. So even in answering that in terms of starting from early childhood, and what I've observed in the Caribbean is in England, what they're doing is bridging the gap between mental health and the education system, where it's in every area of development. But in the Caribbean, there's still some very traditional methods of early childcare, and the methodologies have not upgraded and modernized to also develop the emotional element, which is a key factor in growth mindset in terms of executive function, in terms of regulation of self, regulation of behavior, building that empathy, even identifying developmental disorders and challenges, things like autism. If those things are caught early, instead of saying, oh, the child is just slow or they're just this, then we're able to actually create the growth mindset for persons with special needs or who are differently able, which create inclusivity. So if parents know what to advocate for, then the education system, and if the education system is flexible enough to respond to that, and if we have advocates. So one of my biggest thing is that sometimes you have to stretch your neck out, even though you think it's gonna get chopped a little, to push for things that are necessary in the education system and even in the legal system, creating the policies and the laws to really incorporate a growth culture where inclusivity and diversity is not only a conversation, the same how we created COVID protocols, we create growth protocols, the same how we could create things and pivot it so quickly because of what we focus on. We can do that as well for our parents, and really across the generational lines. So not only parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles. I know for myself as a clinician in college, my students refer each other. They start that growth conversation, and it's really having that language being perpetuated from an early stage and helping parents understand that if we don't build children who can be adaptable and resilient and grow, when you and I are 60, Demario, what would our future look like if
That's
our younger ones don't learn that particular mindset and that theory?
That is certainly true. And I just think it's really important. Mrs. Baptiste, the person who asked this question, did make a comment, and it's really it's in the same vein as what you were saying. And she was saying, I'm a school principal, so I truly believe that while we work on the growth mindset of each member of the school, inclusive of students, these very students have to go back to homes where fixed mindsets are more prevalent.
But what I want to add to that too, and I think it's something we sometimes ignore, the teachers, the workers. I'm a strong advocate for taking care of your workers, because even if you realize with the pandemic, our children spend majority of their times in school and school settings, and they learn from their teachers. If you have conversations with students, or even for me, in terms of many of my role models or who I would have maybe emulated or really taken on, even though my home played a factor, because of work, our children spend majority of their time in the education system and interacting with educators. And when you listen to the language, not that I'm saying that the virtual learning has not been difficult, but the language has not been perpetuating adaptability. It's not been perpetuating resilience. It's not been perpetuating that this is how the future is going to look, and this is how it looked for some time. And our children can find a space, and we can create a space to make it, educational friendly and to make it growth friendly. So even our educators as well, with the parents, with administrators, can create that growth mindset as well for our children.
Awesome, awesome. I have one final question from Kathleen, and I find it's comedic, but it's a serious thing as well. So education, especially remote learning, continues to be hampered by ISPs like Flow and Digital, right, who continue to provide shoddy internet services, and I'm quoting here, and take money for proper service while children are left high and dry. We need growth, but how is it possible to grow amidst all of these realities? And of course, this is only one of such harsh realities that we face.
And I think it's also linked to the question of the barriers and the bias too. The thing is that, and you could correct me, I haven't been in every Caribbean island to know policies, but we don't have enough safeguards to keep our companies in check when it comes to really creating that disparity between the haves and the have-nots.
That's fair.
And the thing is that because we are still thinking that as a region, we are developing countries, but the conversation of developing, we have to then link is our mindsets developing in terms of our policies and infrastructures, in terms of understanding that some of these companies come from overseas and they're also seeing gaps in our system that there are no gatekeepers for. So in terms of even Flow and Digital creating mechanisms to have some children in school looking at the COVID policies, looking at how we could improve the infrastructure in the school system, as opposed to giving everybody a device or just improving the internet service. The thing is that it then creates another dichotomy in terms of creating those barriers. So we have bigger barriers and sub barriers and subcultures and these different things being created because, again, we're not looking at the whole in terms of in the next 5 years when immunity becomes stabilized, when and I'm not going to start an argument over vaccines, but when certain mechanisms and science develop different things, when that sector is doing what it has to do, create balance, then what's going to happen to all these other devices and all these different things? And are we then going to have a huge poverty situation in our economy? Is technology going to really be balanced in terms of, is it then adaptable to what's happening, or is it reacting to what's happening based on just an economic perspective? So all the other social elements and other sectors are left, in a disadvantaged area. And unfortunately, our children suffer because if you think about it too, we tend to have an infrastructure focused perspective rather than a human capital focused perspective. Yes. So not enough is then invested into our human capital, and that is what's also contributing, in my opinion, to some of the disparities between, within the different sectors.
Right. Excellent points. I'm going to try to squeeze one more question in, if you don't mind. Coming from Trevor Lane. All right, and he's asking, is it possible for you to elaborate a bit more on obsession with competence and specifically how it is that it is a barrier to growth?
Right. So maybe to break it down where, and the truth is sometimes I tend to have a struggle with that too. So I might do a set of courses or do a lot of different things where some things can be learned on the job. So you may have somebody, there's a difference between wanting to do your best and wanting to know what to do. But the obsession is where it's holding you back from taking that risk. So there are certain elements of risk that you need in learning. So for example, let's say so I'll use my profession as an example. So you graduated a master's degree, but the master's degree gives you enough information, but there are certain things that you come face to face in a session that you may not have all the adequate training for, but you have some. But you can take that risk to learn from the client, but then allow yourself to know, okay, this is something I need to learn and work on, but it's not going to stop me from taking that risk. And it's balancing the ethics and also balancing the standards, because every profession has its own ethical standards. But the obsession is when it's stopping you from moving forward. or it's where you're saying that, okay, I'm not competent enough, so I can't apply for this job. And I even had my own experience where, I would say, well, do I have enough experience in this? And I don't apply. But I have other experiences that I can pull from. So before I came into psychology, I was a secretary. So I have good time management and typing skill there, right? Then I would have been an intern for certain areas. So I have that experience. But the obsession is when it's holding you back. There's nothing wrong in questioning your or wondering, do I qualify for it? But if it's becoming a situation that you're ruminating or holding you back from taking that calculated risk and taking a little plunge that is necessary for growth. I hope that
Right.
answers.
Awesome, it does. Awesome, it does. Due to my oversight, I missed a question, and I really think it would be a disservice to Michelle if I do not ask it. And so she's asking, do you think it would help to introduce psychology at the CAPE level in order to sensitize youths to these critical components of health and success?
As a psychologist, I do have a bias. I would even say introduce it to break down psychology to a primary level, but in a different way. So introducing things like emotional intelligence at a primary level. Because the introduction to psychology is a subject. But just like how UB has, these soft skill courses and these different things, young people are hungry for information. And I think we overlook, and not just looking at young people, people on a whole are hungry for information because growth is a natural part of our existence as humans. So even though sometimes we're stuck and we don't want to take that plunge, we still want to know what to do. So eventually when we are ready, we could know what to do. And maybe something I forgot to add in my presentation is when somebody is stuck in a fixed mindset, before judging is asking what do they need or what are they doing to keep themselves safe. So even our curriculum is doing, every persons who are in charge have a particular mindset and accomplishment that they want to achieve. But maybe they just also need that push as well to say, hey, we need to break this down in a different realm. So yes, I am all for introducing psychology at CAPE level, but the thing is with psychology being a subject, are our students going to learn the key components of psychology? So let's open it out a bit. Let's put in some career mapping to help them decide at a Form 3 level where they're going and what world of work really looks like outside of a subject area, right? What are professionals looking for? When they post up their stuff on social media, how is that going to impact them in the long run? Or even as adults, how to be more technically savvy, how to use technologies better. So yes, Michelle, I agree. I'm all for psychology being introduced into the curriculum.
Well, of course. I'm not seeing any more questions. And so I'd just like to thank you so much for an engaging presentation and an equally engaging discussion about this very important issue.
There's one more question.
Oh, where?
There's one more.
Oh, wow, Mr. Lane again. Is it when one is corrected, one feels one's competence is questioned?
Yes, and that also goes into the delivery of the feedback as well.
Right. Oh, right. I completely understand that. Okay, so I hope that at least our appetites have been whet. It seems as though there may even be a space for a much larger discussion on this issue. And it's just really great to see that we are all able to engage with this very important topic. So thank you so much again, Mrs. Gaymes Mohess. I hope to say Dr. Gaymes Mohess very soon. Fingers crossed, right? And thank you so much for just a really great session. Thank you to all those persons that joined wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Bonjour, hola, konnichiwa. Right. All of the languages. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again in the next series. Thank you all. And do have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day.